Joy.
I understand the economic arguments for having expensive parking on the street and less expensive parking in the parking decks. You'd like to turn the street spaces over more frequently and have people who want to park for a longer time be in the parking decks. So at that economics one-on-one level, it makes sense. As a city resident, I find something onerous about the idea that you're never off the city's dime, and that there's never a time when it doesn't cost you something simply to be downtown. And I think that allowing people to park downtown after conventional business hours is a small courtesy and a way of making the city a little more friendly. I think that the parking decks are great places to go, but I think that the streets after 6 o'clock should be available to people. It's another annoyance of being in Ann Arbor to take that away. I think we want to not give out the idea that Ann Arbor is a really annoying place to be, and I think this is one of those things that contributes to that image. So I would not support having the meters running after 6 o'clock.
Okay. John, I'll begin with you on this question, and we'll stay on the topic of downtown parking and the DDA. The city went through a very difficult budget process this year in which there was the very real prospect of significant cuts of police officers and firefighters beyond what has been reduced already. In the end, that was prevented ultimately primarily by the DDA giving the city an additional $2 million that comes from parking revenue. If you were on council, would you have voted on that as the solution to the city's budget problem? And do you see that as an ongoing solution? Would you take that approach again next year if the city finds itself in the same fiscal position?
I think we may have found an issue on which Newcombe and I will disagree. The police and fire budget was reduced as much by reducing wage and pension costs as by anything else. The threat of massive layoffs was used to try and bargain the unions down at taking lesser wages and lesser pensions. So it wasn't simply taking revenue from the DDA. That said, I'm not really clear why the DDA isn't a part of city government. They're a very competent organization. They do many things well. And frankly, I'd like to have that competence apply across the city. And it doesn't make sense to me that they don't apply to Roger Frazier. I can't think of anything they do that they couldn't do if they were a part of city government. The one piece that is different because they're a downtown development authority is the tax increment financing, which takes the additional revenues from new development downtown and provides them to the DDA to work. I have concerns with that because by its nature, it means those funds don't run through the city's normal budget process, and projects that would have been funded if those tax increment financing dollars ran to the city budget aren't funded, and projects of the DDA that wouldn't survive the normal city budgeting process get funded. So it's a way of guaranteeing we have some misallocation of funds. So I think DDA ought to be a part of the city, and I think that tax increment financing is not helpful to us. And I think if we made those two things, the issue goes away.
Well, I actually would agree that I think making some of the DDA part of city government would be a good idea. That's kind of why I'm sitting here. A couple of clarifications. Right now, we give to the city per year more than we collect in TIF, by over almost $1 million. The minute we started collecting more than we need to fulfill our mission as DDA members, that is tax money, and it is not our responsibility to spend it. I would feel, and still feel, it's perfectly appropriate to give that money to the city, to elected officials. However, that is not the mechanism in which we're currently transferring money. The mechanism we're currently transferring money is a breach of contract that has not yet been cleaned. Now, can you imagine if the city didn't have us around to grab that money, and frankly, if we knew it was going to be for police protection when they asked for it, we would have done it in a heartbeat. but there was no strings attached, and there continues to be no strings attached. But take, for example, if the city needed money and we weren't around and they went to the library and they said, you know, you're collecting taxes and you got 50 copies of Casino Royale, clearly you have a lot of money, we're gonna just take it. Or what if they went to the AATA and said, you know what, no one really votes in that neighborhood, we need the money that you use for that bus route, and they just take it. That's what's happening right now. If the city needs the money, if the city wants us to collect more than we need to fulfill our mission, they have every legal right to work out a mechanism to take that money. And I'd agree with that. But right now, we are now on almost the 7th breach of contract. And they do this because it's politically expedient to do. I think the quote that the incumbent gave when asked about it was institutional amnesia. Well, they're going into some pretty heavy labor negotiations, and I would hate for them to have institutional amnesia when they're talking about people's livelihoods.
Okay. Newcombe, we begin with you with the next question. The city has a percent for art program under which 1% of the money toward a development project goes to support art in association with that project. There have been attempts in the current economy to delay that program, to reduce that program, not specifically a proposal to eliminate it, but potentially that could be proposed. Do you support the percent for art the way it's being used right now, or would you scale it back in some fashion?
I wouldn't scale it back, but I don't support the way it's being used right now. The limitations put on it, where you have to design a project based on the source of the funds, is why we have $1 million fountains instead of 10 pretty incredible art pieces around our city. You look at what Cleveland does with their 1% program, and it's amazing. Most cities that have 1% programs actually do an incredible job. Seattle actually uses some of their 1% program for performing arts, and I think that's a great idea. The data says it's a great idea. However, as it's currently being administrated, it's just rife with winners and losers. It's confusing to a lot of people. People that invest in Ann Arbor usually make money, and adding 1% on the private sector would be a good way to balance some of this, instead of just jamming it all onto public infrastructure improvements and then having the further restriction of having some sort of art-inspired buy. So I believe in the concept. It's been proven out time and time again in some of the best cities in America and around the world, similar programs. I just don't think we're there yet. And I understand it's a new program, but abandoning it because of difficult times is what Michigan does best. And right now, Michigan is 51st in the nation in arts funding. We're behind Guam. Ohio, with a similar economy, is 3rd. We have a serious priority problem in Michigan when we start abandoning the arts.